Hey everyone, welcome back to the Reigning Kingdom podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Menning, and I'm really excited that you guys are back here for this episode. And just want to thank you all for joining in on these episode after episode as we unpack everything that we've been working on. And I hope you all had a Merry Christmas and are beginning everything off with a Happy New Year here in early 2026. So, if you've been following along, if you've been watching our episodes in order, which you don't have to, but if you were, you know that we've already laid out a lot of groundwork over the last several weeks, talking a lot about little season eschatology. We've also dove deep into what was actually taught in Matthew 24. What did Jesus say in Matthew 24? Who was he speaking to? And then we dove into the birth and the influence of dispensationalism and futurism. So we begin to touch on some of those, so that episode we talked a lot about the Schofield Reference Bible and John Nelson Darby and all of those things, trying to kind of get our mind around why is this modern end times teaching, in my opinion, disconnected from what Jesus actually said and disconnected from what we actually read in the Bible. So, looking through all of that, today what we're going to dive into is Daniel 9, and it's specifically the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel, because as you're going through this, and anytime you're trying to lay out eschatology and look at what they consider the quote unquote end times discussions, which is something I'd like to talk a little bit further about. I don't think it's actually end times discussion at all. It's the end of an old covenant and the beginning of a new covenant. But the way it's talked about today, it's like it's the end of the world. It's apocalyptic, and but anyway, I digress. What I'm getting at there is anytime you start talking about quote unquote end times discussions, you'll get comments. You'll have people mention, "Hey, you gotta dive into Daniel." So we're gonna spend some time going through some of those over the next few episodes. The one we're gonna dive into today is specifically the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9. So, what if I told you that a large percentage of the time that Daniel 9 is preached, maybe even up to 70% of the time, it's presented in a futurist doctrine? It's preached or taught about to specifically talk about things like a future 7-year tribulation, a future Antichrist. You'll see a strong focus when they talk about Daniel 9, today's Israel and what's going on over there. You'll hear a lot about the talk of a future rebuilt temple or a revived sacrifice system. And then you'll hear about it and you'll talk about it and we're going to go into this a lot today, is this huge 2,000-year gap between the 69th week and the 70th week of fulfilling that prophecy. So we're going to dive into that today. There's kind of some tension there around this and what was meant to be talked about in the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. Where does that puzzle piece fit? And what makes the most sense? And we'll address the gap in there that many people talk about, this gap that's supposedly out there for 2,000 years. So before I even get started, though, if you've watched other videos about the 70 weeks prophecy, or you've tried to dive into this yourself, it can be confusing. It can be overwhelming. It might even make you feel dumb sometimes. And it's kind of crazy to think that, you just putting this episode together challenged me a little bit, because you'll read what it says and you're like, well, that's fairly simple. There's some tricky parts in there, but for the most part, I get this and it's fairly simple. You'll do some research on it and you're like, okay, I think I kind of get it. And, but then you see all these other interpretations of it, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's hard to understand. Like, how do I figure this out? So you go out and you look at YouTube videos and you'll search those out and they'll say like Daniel's 70 weeks clearly explained, right? And you look at the video, you're like, okay, I think I'm going to watch that one. And if you start to look at it a little closer and you're like, oh my gosh, this is about 2 hours long and there's a whiteboard involved. And before you know it, a lot of these quote unquote clearly explained videos, they're pulling in verses and chapters and what seems like 7 other prophecies into this prophecy. And they're talking about the little horn and the blah, 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 and the beasts. And they get to the end of this one and they feel like they've clearly explained how it was 490 years. The 70 weeks was 490 years. And here we are, literally 2,470 years since then. And they're like, yeah, so, that's why it all makes sense. And you're like, really? I don't get that. That just doesn't make sense to me, but okay. So you jump over to the comments on those videos and you're like, this will restore my faith in humanity. And all the comments say something like, come back soon, Jesus. And thank you to the creator of this video for so clearly explaining it. And I totally understand it now. And I never did before, but now I totally understand it. And you start to think to yourself like, I don't, what do you clearly understand? This didn't make sense. And you start to second guess yourself. You start to second guess what you actually read. Your brain starts to turn into mush. Maybe that's not for you, but that's been my experience with it is I start to go through this and I'm like, what in the world? Oh my gosh, I'm clearly not qualified to understand this because it's so challenging. How these people know to pull in all these different areas and kind of pull it all together and it just makes it far more confusing than it needs to be. And what I'm going to tell you right now is that's not how we're going to dive into this. That's not how we're going to unpack this today. When we walk away from this episode, my hope is really simple for you. My hope is that you can say, yes, I have a good feel for what is said in the Daniel 70 weeks prophecy and the approach we came about it, the way we came about this approach makes a lot of sense to me. And that's it. So, all right. With that said, let's dive in. Before we touch on the prophecy, I think it's important to talk about where are we and who is Daniel? So where are we? We're jumping back in time. So most of these episodes that we've been talking about, little season eschatology, we've been strictly locked into the New Testament. And for this episode, we're jumping back to the Old Testament. So we're before Christ. We're shooting backward about 600 years before Jesus even came on the scene. And to be able to start to talk about what's all coming about with Daniel, when did Daniel live, what was going on at that time. So keep that in the back of your mind. I know for some of you who've been doing this for a long, long time, that's no problem for you. You're like, oh, Daniel, that's way back in the Old Testament. For some of you who are a little bit more like me, who are just getting more and more familiar with this, you might be like, well, where are we talking about here? Nope, not New Testament. Jesus isn't on the scene yet. We're talking about basically God's people, the Jewish people, and what was happening even in Jerusalem at that time. Roughly, we're going to start off about 600 years before Jesus was born. So, all right. With that said, now we kind of got an idea of how far back we are. Let's talk about Daniel. Daniel lived during one of the darkest periods in Israel's history. And So at this point, Jerusalem had been taken over and destroyed. And there was the first temple. So if you remember right, some of this might get a little confusing because there's always these references to the temple. But there's the temple in Jerusalem. It's the center of the Jewish faith. That first temple that was in Jerusalem had now been destroyed, and God's people were scattered. They were conquered. They were humiliated, and they were living under pagan rule. So it's kind of the dark times getting toward the end of the Old Testament. And so Daniel, he was taken into Babylon as a young man. Likely he was a teenager, and he never got to go back home. So he lived his entire adult life in exile, and he was serving under Babylonian kings and then under Persian kings. Multiple different empires kind of rose and fell, and multiple regimes, all of these different kingdoms, I guess you'd say, had come in, taken power, and then a new one had come in and take them over. And he lived through all of that, but through all of that, he remained completely faithful to God. And he knew that his people were scattered and conquered and taken over for a reason. We go into that when we dive into Daniel 9 here in a little bit, but he continued to remain faithful to God through all of it. So, and just to give you a rough idea, he was most likely, it says in there, possibly he was a descendant of King David. And this is the same Daniel whose three closest friends were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember them? They were thrown into the fiery furnace for refusing to bow down to the false god. And it's the same Daniel who'd seen that happen. So he saw what obedience could cost. And then later in his own life, when the new kings passed new laws, he was thrown into the lion's den. And, why was he thrown in there? Because he refused to stop praying to his one true God. So he was pretty bold. He didn't protest anything. He didn't try to be sneaky, but he had tons of faith. So when the earlier parts of Daniel are preached, it's always about faith. It's always about the faith that God will be with you. Talk about the fiery furnace and his friends in the fiery furnace and him in the lion's den and all of those kinds of things. The amount of faith that he had was undeniable. And so that's the Daniel that we're talking about. Then we get over into this later part of Daniel's life, and he's basically repenting and he's reading through Jeremiah, and he's like repenting for his people and the state that they're in. So maybe what we'll do, this might be a good spot to just jump into what is being said in Daniel. So 1 second here. All right, so we'll pull up Daniel 9 here so you get a rough idea of what we're going through here. Basically, it starts off with his prayer for his people. And as you can see, for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by a descendant, a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Okay? So he's praying about that. He says, I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps the covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and we've done wrong. We've acted wickedly and rebelled turning aside from your commandments and rules, and we have not listened to your servants and the prophets who spoke in your name, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and all the people of the land. To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us belongs open shame at this day, to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all of Israel, those who are near and those who are far away, all in the lands which you have driven them, because of the treachery that they have committed against you. So we'll kind of stop there. So what he's doing, this is where he's at. He's, if you remember what I had said a little bit earlier, his people had been taken over. He's praying to God and saying, hey, we screwed up. We screwed up bad. We were supposed to be following you. We were supposed to be doing such and such things, and we weren't doing it. And now this is the judgment that's come upon us, basically. He's like, I get it. Here's what we did wrong. And now we're living under these other kings and these other kingdoms, and it's not good. But I'm reading in Jeremiah, and in Jeremiah it says that this will come to an end. And as we get further into this prayer, so this whole first part of Daniel 9 is really his prayer for his people. As he gets further into this prayer, he starts to say, when will this come to an end? When will my people basically be able to reunite and start over again? So, let's see what else here. As written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come upon us, yet we have not entreated the favor of the Lord our God, turning from our iniquities and gaining insight by your truth. He's like, we're terrible, right? We have completely messed up. So he goes on and on. I mean, he's really just throwing it out there. Then verse 16, he says, O Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and your wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy hill, because of our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers. Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among all who were around us. Now, therefore, O God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy. So please listen, he's saying, to my pleas for mercy, and for your own sake, O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is now desolate. Let's see, where does he go from here? For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake, oh my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. Okay, so he's laying it all out there on the line. And then, verse 20, Gabriel, the angel, brings him an answer. It says, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision, so you'd seen Gabriel before, and we can talk about that in a different part of this chapter. He had seen Gabriel before and heard from Gabriel before, but Gabriel came to him in a swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice, and he made me understand, speaking with me and saying, Daniel, I have come now out to give you insight and understanding. Okay, so Gabriel comes to him and says, coming to you to give you some insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you. You are greatly loved. Therefore, consider this word and understand this vision. Okay, right? So then Gabriel starts to tell him about this 70 weeks. And he's saying, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression and put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity. All right, so I won't dive into that much deeper than that at this moment, but we need to cover that. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again. The squares and moat, but in a troubled time, and therefore the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out onto the desolator. All right. It's a little confusing. It's not necessarily written in the same way we would read it, or we would maybe say those things today, but we're gonna break the whole thing down so you have a really good idea of what's being talked about in there. So, all right, so next what we'll do is we'll talk about the prophecy itself and what was being said in there, and just kind of break down the timeline of it and all the different pieces of it. First of all, the word weeks. Daniel isn't talking about 7-day weeks. He's talking about 7-year weeks. So the Hebrew word here that's used in here is shabuim, and it simply means units of 7. And so it's a units of 7 prophecy, the 70 units of 7. And so when you think about this prophecy, and this is widely accepted from all the different eschatology views out there, different theologians, all of those kinds of things. I mean, nearly 100% accepted that the 70 weeks that's being talked about is a total of 490 years. Every week of this prophecy is 7 full years. So instead of it being a day of a week, it's being a year of the week. So that part might get a little bit tricky to wrap your mind around because we're so used to using weeks in the context of days. But that's what's being talked about in here. It's a 490-year period. So who is this prophecy about? So modern futurist doctrines a lot of times will make this be about us. Maybe it was about what's going to happen in America, what happened when Hitler was on the rise, what's happening in Europe, what's happening, da 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 da. Gabriel's very specific in this and describes that this 70 weeks are being decreed for your people and your holy city. So we got the who and we got the place, right? In fact, just to make sure we are bringing that home, I'm going to just do this here a minute. We're going to talk about that just in detail. All right, so let's get down here. 70 weeks are decreed upon thy people and upon thy holy city, right? So we know the who and we know the where. It's about their holy city in Jerusalem, and it's about Daniel's people, the Jewish people who loved God. All right. All right. Then what else is talked about in there? Let's make sure we get that part done. What does Gabriel say will be accomplished in those 490 years? And this part's huge. Gabriel says that by the end of this period, God will finish his transgression of the Jewish people, make atonement for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, and seal up vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. So to me, what that is saying is he's going to wrap this whole plan up. And Daniel, I'm giving you some insight as to how that's going to happen. You're mainly asking about when is this transgression of your people going to end? And he's saying pretty clearly, hey, this is how it's going to end. We're going to finish that transgression. And then there's going to be atonement for iniquity, meaning there's going to be a new way to atone for sin. The sacrifices will come to an end. We don't have to sacrifice, a dove for this sin and a lamb for that sin, and animal sacrifices will come to an end. We will bring in everlasting righteousness, and we will seal up the vision and prophecy and anoint the most holy. So those are the things that are going to be accomplished in those 490 years. Now we're going to dive into the most debated part of this, which really shouldn't be the most debated part of it, is how is this time divided up, and what is exactly said in the Bible as to how this is going to be done. So in order to do that, we're going to zoom out a little bit. We just said that 70-week prophecy equals about 490 years. I don't even think it's 490 years is what that is. So the real question isn't how long it would take to get from the beginning to the end of this. It's when does it start? What happens along the way? And where did this prophecy end in real history? So, because once you start to answer those three questions, the puzzle piece that we were talking about fits exactly where it needs to fit. You don't have to jam it into place. You don't have to do anything weird like cut the puzzle piece in half and put half of it over here and half of it over here. That's not how this one goes together. It fits perfectly into place, and it has a place in this puzzle. So let's break it down here a minute. All right, so breaking down the different years in all of this and what all happened. As you go through Daniel 9, you'll see that it's broken into 3 periods. And 2 of the periods are kind of linked together. We'll discuss that here in a minute. And then there's the last period. So it's pretty simple when you break it down this way, and we'll dive in with a little more detail here in just a second. But period 1 is about the first 7 weeks. So it's about the first 49 years, right? So we got 7 weeks of the 70, and that is the first period. The second period is this long waiting period, and it's 62 weeks, 434 years. So if you're doing the math on this, you got your 7 weeks and your 62 weeks. So we've got 69 weeks out of the 70 weeks taken care of by the time we get through period 2. And then the controversial week, the one that seems to be some debate about, which I don't quite understand why. Well, I do understand why, and we'll talk about the why here in a bit. But the last period is that last week, that last 7 years. And so it's really 3 periods. It's a 7-week period at the beginning, which is 49 years. It's a 62-week period in the middle, which is 434 years. And then it's this final week of 7 years and what all happens during that final week of 7 years. So let's first go into this first 49 years. What was said was going to happen. So Daniel 9 says the clock starts with this. It says, the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Pretty simple wording in there. The clock starts with that. The going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, as history would have it, Artaxerxes' decree in 457 BC was set forth to do just that. The decree didn't just allow people to go back, but it authorized things like rebuilding the walls, getting the civil governance back in order, getting the temple had already been worked on, but getting things moving again, having judicial authority, rebuilding Jerusalem as a functioning city. And that's what that decree actually kicked off, and that was in 457 BC. And Daniel's told by Gabriel in this vision that Jerusalem shall be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in troubled times. And when you line it up with history, that's exactly what happened. There was opposition. There were threats. There was political pressure. Some people didn't like it. There was economic hardship. There was all of those kind of things. But for 49 years, that whole first period did happen. Jerusalem became rebuilt and got that city. It was back up on its feet and things started functioning again. Now, one thing you're going to notice when you're reading through this, I want you to, because this tripped me up a little bit, is different versions, different translations of the Bible are going to have things written out just a little bit different. So let me show you this. So to give you a rough idea, I was just on the American Standard Version. Let me stick with that a minute and show you what this one says. So the American Standard Version says, now therefore and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the anointed one, the prince. Okay, so it's basically, let's stop right there. It's saying from the time that the command goes out to rebuild the city to the time of the anointed one, the prince, or the Messiah, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is the 62 weeks. That's how it's worded in the American Standard Version. And it shall be built again with streets and a moat, even in troublous times. And after the 62 weeks, the 62 weeks is what that's saying, the anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Okay. Remember what was just said there, because we're going to go over to the King James Version, which I know many of you, many of us feel like, okay, this is probably the most accurate version we can go to. It is important to look these things up and have an idea of what the different versions say. I would say the American Standard Version lined up almost perfectly here with the King James Version. That's a good thing. There are differences, though, and a lot of you have Bibles in your hands that say this differently. So, King James Version says, know, therefore, and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, from that starting point unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, comma, and 62 weeks, which means 62 weeks, right? It's worded funny in here, but that's what it means. So it's saying from the beginning of the first period to the end of the second period, these things are going to happen. Because it's basically saying, here's some things that are going to happen in the first section, and here's some things that are going to happen in the second section. The Messiah is going to come back, but he's not going to come back in the first 7 weeks. He's going to come back after the end of the 62 weeks, right? Okay. The reason I'm bringing all this up and really just making sure I dive into it is a very popular version is the ESV. And many of the modern versions have it this way. And this did trip me up, I will tell you that. All right, so now therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word, so it's not as good a language either. It's really the commandment to restore the city. It's a commandment from an earthly person, but still. Going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. They put a period in here. And then they start the next sentence with an and. Probably isn't the right way. In the original Hebrew, there's no punctuation. They don't have that punctuation like that. So it just runs on. And so In the ESV, they decided to put this period here and start a new sentence. I don't think it's correct. There shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and a moat, but in a troubled time. That one gets a little hard to understand, because if you're reading through that, you might be thinking, like, wait a minute, what? Like, is the Messiah supposed to come back at the end of the 49 years, the first 7 weeks? Like I mentioned before, the original Hebrew has no punctuation, no commas, no periods. So translators had to decide where to put the breaks in there. That's why the ESV version sounds a lot like it does. Things like the King James Version and the New King James read it differently. They say the 7 weeks plus the 62 weeks, then the Messiah appears. And so I wanted to make sure you saw that in there, because you may be trying to follow along at home, or may try to read this and you're like, I don't know, this is not making sense to me. So I think that's important to point out in there. All right, with that said, I'm moving away from this version, and we're going to go to the New King James Version here once. I want to see how this one reads, to be honest with you, because I haven't read this version of it. That from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so it talks about the Messiah being cut off or crucified, and not just for himself. We'll kind of dive into that part of it here in a little bit. But I think that's interesting to talk about. So there's those 3 sections. Let's talk about the 62 weeks here for a minute, that 434 years. What's going on during that time? Now, the city's been rebuilt. Prophecy really doesn't say anything dramatic happens during that time. It's really the silent stretch of this 70 weeks prophecy. During that time, there's different governments that rule over the area, but Jerusalem's allowed to keep on going, and the Jewish people are allowed to keep on doing what they're doing. There's Persian rule, Greek rule, Roman rule, but no new revelations happening. A lot of it's just waiting. And so it does say at the end of that 62 weeks, the end of that additional 434 years, added on to the first 49 years, which means we're at the 483-year period, then an anointed one shall appear. So let's do the math on that. We started off in 457 BC. We've got to add 483 years to that, which brings us all the way to AD 27. Well, what happened in AD 27? That is when Jesus stepped onto the public stage. He was baptized. He begins his public ministry and starts to talk about the kingdom of God being at hand. It's amazing to me how the precision in this prophecy that was way back in the Old Testament, where it says, hey, this is what's going to happen. They're going to put a decree out. They're going to start rebuilding Jerusalem. Then there's going to be 400 and some odd years, blah, 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 blah. You guys are going to do your thing. Then this Messiah is going to come on. He's going to come on the scene and start preaching about all of it. It's right down to basically right down to the year, where it's like, boom, it's happening exactly the way they said it was going to happen. So with all that said, would there be any reason to think that we wouldn't have the final 7 years happen exactly the way Gabriel said it would happen. Well, if you start Googling 70-week prophecies, and I'll show you some of those here in a little bit, you're gonna find a lot of them that have a gap then. They're gonna say, hey, we got through the first 69 weeks, and then there's this 2,000-year gap where we have a church age, and then tribulation is coming in the future. Because like we've talked about in episode after episode is the loudest kid in the room when it comes to eschatology has been this futurist doctrine, this dispensational doctrine. And that doctrine believes that the tribulation that's talked about in the Bible is coming up in our future, and that Jesus hasn't reigned, that his kingdom hasn't started here on earth, that all of that stuff's coming up in the future. So they put a gap in this 70-week prophecy, and they say this part hasn't happened yet. Well, let's take a look at this part, and let's discern for ourselves. Has period 3, the final week, this last 7 years, has that happened? So, in the book of Daniel, it says, after the 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be cut off, but not for himself. Well, we know this. Jesus was crucified, not for his sin, but for ours. And when that happened, something really interesting happened. In the temple, the veil, I believe it was the veil that they use over there. I don't know what they use the veil for, honestly. I think it was over there by the sacrifices, was torn in two from top to bottom, or from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. Well, and when he was crucified, the need for those sacrifices ended. That whole sacrificial system ended. Hebrews tells us, where there's forgiveness, there's no longer any offering for sin, right? So in Daniel, it says, he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. Yep, says right there. He shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. Well, that's exactly what happened, and it matched up to Jesus' death on the cross. So, what things happen after that? Desolation follows. Daniel finishes by saying, the city will be destroyed again, meaning in the future it will be destroyed again. Desolation will follow, and the determined end will be poured out. Well, what do we know happens after Jesus died on the cross? We know that died on the cross, he's raised from the dead. The need for all the sacrifices ended. There was atonement for our sin. All of those things were fulfilled. But a lot of them who look to this futurist doctrine will look at this and they'll say, okay, they'll go to verse 27 and they say, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. So when they read this, they take the he here and apply it to a future antichrist or a future leader who makes a deal with Israel. And then it's a 7-year, basically like a 7-year peace treaty, right? So I know this sounds crazy, but this, if you go and watch enough of these futurist doctrine try to explain the 70 weeks of Daniel, they will say, and then this is where the gap is. And what we're waiting for is somebody to make a 7-year peace treaty with Israel. And 3.5 years into that 7-year peace treaty, they will sever it, and they will bring an end to the sacrifices and the offerings and all of that kind of thing. And all of this, by the way, is going to happen after they rebuild the third temple, because we need that third temple, not we, they need the third temple there to be going and having sacrifices again, which haven't happened for 2,000 years. I know this sounds crazy, but that's what's being taught out there when you start looking at a futurist doctrine with all of that. Is that the temple needs to come back, needs to be rebuilt again. So they're grabbing this part of it here and they're saying in the final week of Daniel's 70 weeks, that stuff's all going to happen in the future. I can't even get my head around it because it doesn't make sense. So I get it. Some of that stuff I just mentioned, it might be a little hard to wrap your mind around. How can those with a futurist doctrine be thinking of it this way? And how can those of us who think all of this has been fulfilled think of it a different way? Let me show you. This might give you a rough idea what you're going to see out there if you start to look for end times videos discussing Daniel 9. And you're going to see a lot of this. I'm not picking on this person in particular. I'm just showing you this is what you're going to see out there. So let me share this one. All right, I think you guys are seeing that. This is a short, so this is only going to take a second here.
Let's look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. And it is one of the most detailed prophecies about the end times. It speaks of 70 weeks or 490 years decreed for Israel. Now, this is including the coming of the Messiah and the final period of tribulation. Now, the first 69 weeks, which is 483 years, were fulfilled exactly with Jesus' crucifixion. But the final 7-year period, known as the tribulation, is still to come. This will be a time of great distress, obviously before Jesus is returning. Daniel's prophecy reminds us that history is unfolding according to God's plan, and that we are closer and closer with every day to this final 7 years. Are you ready for Christ's return? Follow for more. Let's look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 20.
All right, so as you can see, that's what we're getting at. Are you ready for Jesus' return? Are you this final week is put out into the future. We're going to have the time of tribulation is coming up. It's in our future, all of that kind of thing. And as we talked about in the Matthew 24 episode, we talked about in just Satan's Little Season episode, as we've been unpacking this, we realize this whole time of the end has already happened. That has easily fits into Jesus' return, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the new covenant, the new age, his covenant with the Jewish people ending with Jesus on the cross, and a new age beginning at this point. But futurism in Christianity starts to sound a little bit more like this and what we're showing right here. And I think that can mess with the way you think about the Bible, where you start to read through and you're like, well, this isn't exactly the way it says it is. Maybe it challenges what you think is true in the Bible and what you don't think is true in the Bible. So I just think that can be a little risky. Here's another thing I'd want to show you is if you start to Google Daniel 9, 70 weeks timelines, a lot of what you're going to see is going to be this kind of stuff. Let me see if I can find this for you. All right. So a lot of what you're going to see is this kind of stuff where it goes through and shows all of these different timelines that say, here was the first 7 weeks, here's the next 62 weeks, da 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 da, and then a gap, a church age gap. You can see this one's a lot the same. 69 weeks, time of the Gentiles, present church age, prophetic gap, da da da. Then we're going to have the rapture and the glorious reappearing of Jesus, and all of that stuff's going to be wrapped up. You can see this one out here, 70 weeks of years. Da da da. It's got this big church week. So I hate to beat up on those beliefs and that thought process, but my core message with all of this is that Daniel wasn't asking, hey, when is the end of the world coming? He was asking what's going to happen to his people. And God answered him in a very clear prophecy through Gabriel that it'll happen over one continuous 490-year period. Jerusalem becomes restored, the Messiah comes, sin is dealt with, sacrifice ends, the city falls, and a new age begins. It's really that simple. Walking through each one of those, that puzzle piece falls right into place. It fits that whole 490-year period there. It lands perfectly with when Jesus came, died on the cross, came back. All of those things fit right exactly into place the way they need to. Have you ever been, I don't know if you guys ever had this. I remember when I was a little kid, we'd be putting puzzles together, and then maybe you'd be doing it with someone that was so sure this puzzle piece should fit in a certain spot that they'd almost like jam it in, or they'd like, I don't even know if this ever happened in real life, but take a scissors and, we're going to have to cut this puzzle piece in half because half of it's got to go over here and the other half's got to go over there. It kind of feels like that's what's going on with this. There is a perfect spot where it fits. We don't need to cut it. We don't need to stretch it. We don't have to shove any modern headlines into it. It fits exactly where it's supposed to fit. And the thing I want to say to all of you is when you start to see videos like that one I just shared, or you start to see these timelines where there's this big gap, and then you go back to the Bible and you're like, wow, I guess maybe this is all too complicated for me. It's not too complicated for you. Sometimes it's not the message that's complicated, it's the messenger. And I'm hoping today that we were able to decipher what was being said in the 70 weeks, where it fits into the puzzle, help you to understand you don't need a scissors in there to cut that puzzle piece in half and put a big gap in between it. It fits exactly where it was supposed to fit. Everything played out the way the Bible said it was supposed to play out. And I would challenge you to not be deceived by a futurist view that may throw off your confidence in what you're reading in the Bible. So, with all that said, reread this, pull out your own Bible, take a look at what's being said, compare it to the things we just talked about, and ask yourself what makes sense to you. Does that puzzle piece fit exactly where we talked about it fitting? Or is what's said in there said that there's supposed to be a gap in there? To me, the gap doesn't make sense at all. It makes perfect sense to me that timeline is complete and that Daniel's 70 weeks have been fully fulfilled, and we can check that prophecy off as being finished. So with that said, please stop thinking that the Bible's too complicated for you to understand. Like I said earlier, sometimes it's not the message, it's the messenger. Sometimes it's not the scripture, it's the interpretations. We saw today that sometimes translations can mess with that a bit. So pray about it, think about it. But if you ever feel like you're reading through this and you're hearing other viewpoints and you feel like you're stuck in an escape room and you're afraid to ask any questions about it, don't be afraid to ask. Anyway, don't take my word for it. Read through all of that without any preconceived notions and quit forcing it into things that you've learned elsewhere. Let it teach you exactly what it says and see where that takes you. That's why I believe we live in a time of Christ's reign, challenged by deception, but grounded in what Jesus had actually said. So with that said, I hope this episode encourages you. I hope it helps you understand Daniel's 70 weeks that much more in Daniel 9. And I hope it gives you some confidence to be able to say, wait a minute, nope, what's said in there is actually what happened. So if you've got questions, you can reach out to me at jeremy@reigningkingdom.com, or you can comment on this episode right here on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. With all that said, I will be back with more in the coming weeks. But until next time, keep reigning on, everyone. See you all soon.